Welcome to this explainer. Okay, so have you ever stared at one of those mesmerizing, glowing jellyfish just floating effortlessly through an aquarium and thought, man, I really want one of those for my living room? Well, today we're going to unpack why keeping jellyfish is far less about bringing home a simple new pet and significantly more about engineering a delicate, custom-built life support machine. It's a fascinating process, but it requires absolute precision.
Today, we are laying out the exact blueprint for a thriving jellyfish aquarium. We're going to cover 1. The Jellyfish Challenge, 2. Engineering perfect water flow, 3. Designing a safe habitat, and 4. Chemistry, light, and feeding. Let's dive right in.
All right, Section 1, the Jellyfish Challenge, not your average fish tank. This right here is the fundamental dilemma of keeping these ethereal creatures in captivity.
When we picture standard aquarium pets, your typical community fish, we're usually thinking about highly adaptable creatures. They can thrive in a standard rectangular glass box with totally varied, even chaotic water flow. But jellyfish? Yeah, they are a completely different story. Their tissues are so incredibly delicate, they're vulnerable to things a normal fish wouldn't even bat an eye at. We're talking about severe tissue damage from just basic turbulence, sharp edges, or surfaces that might trap them. So you literally cannot just adapt a jellyfish to a standard tank. You actually have to adapt the entire environment to the jellyfish.
Moving on to Section 2, Engineering Perfect Water Flow, the Invisible Architecture. To overcome that immense fragility we just talked about, aquarists have to engineer the invisible architecture of the tank itself.
Now, the absolute holy grail for a jellyfish keeper is a concept called suspension. Listen, every single piece of plumbing, every pump, every curve in that habitat, it all serves one crucial overarching purpose, keeping the jellyfish in a state of constant, gentle suspension. You really want to create this perfectly controlled flow that keeps the animals evenly distributed right in the middle of the water column. If they're colliding with the sides or, heaven forbid, sinking to the bottom, the system is failing them. The water itself basically has to act as their protective cushion.
So how do we get there? Achieving that perfect balance actually starts with the physical shape of the tank. You're going to see a lot of jellyfish tanks using rounded bottoms. Why? Because it stops the animals from getting stuck in stagnant 90-degree corners. From there, it's this meticulous balancing act, adjusting flow rates, experimenting with intricate baffle designs, and totally optimizing your pump placement. You have to provide just enough movement to keep them from sinking, but absolutely not so much that they get battered and tossed around by the currents. It's crazy, but even a tiny tweak after the tank is set up can completely alter how these guys position themselves in the water.
Which brings us to Section 3, Designing a Safe Habitat, Eliminating Physical Hazards. Because honestly, mastering that invisible water flow, that's really only half the battle. The physical hardware itself has to be entirely reimagined to keep them safe.
Bringing standard aquarium gear into a jelly setup introduces massive hidden risks. Things like standard water outlets, regular intake screens, rough surfaces, tight corners. These are all just background equipment in a normal tank, right? But in a jellyfish tank, a standard intake screen can basically create a localized suction that acts like a vacuum trap. If a delicate tentacle gets snagged in there, or if the animal gets pulled against a rough surface, well, the results can be absolutely devastating.
Because of those risks, system modifications aren't just highly recommended, they are strictly mandatory. To make a system truly jellyfish safe, you absolutely must use smooth materials throughout the entire habitat, no exceptions. Plus, you have to thoughtfully configure the filtration. You do this by using covered intakes to diffuse the suction so widely that the draw never ever pulls the animals into contact with the hardware. You are essentially child-proofing the tank, but for an incredibly delicate floating organism.
All right, Section 4, Chemistry, Light, and Feeding, the living water. Once the physical structure and water flow are totally locked in, we have to tackle the microscopic balance of the living water itself.
Setting up the water chemistry requires a ton of patience. You absolutely cannot rush a jellyfish habitat. Step 1 requires a long lead time for cycling the tank to establish a really robust biological balance. You've got to verify that all your target parameters, think temperature, salinity, are perfectly stable long before the animals even arrive. You do not want deadly swings in ammonia, nitrite, or nitrate levels. And finally, because jellyfish are so incredibly sensitive to crowding and waste, you have to stock the tank very gradually, all while keeping a careful, constant eye on things.
Then we have to engineer the lighting. And no, this isn't just about making the tank look cool for your living room. The environment has to be so perfectly tailored that the light actually serves a biological function. You need to know exactly what species you're dealing with. Say your jellyfish, like some moon jelly variants, for example, rely on symbiotic algae for energy. If that's the case, you need strictly controlled photoperiods to support them, without accidentally triggering a massive algae bloom in your tank. But even if you have a non-dependent species, generic aquarium settings just won't cut it. You still have to match the exact light intensity and timing to their specific biology, just to keep their stress levels down.
Finally, let's talk about feeding. It's a major variable that affects literally everything else in the tank, creating what aquarists call the particulate problem. If you use the wrong food size, feed them way too much, or even just have an inconsistent feeding schedule, you're going to quickly skyrocket the nutrient load in the water, and that inevitably leads to detritus building up in any of those dead zones your flow hasn't quite managed to reach.
And that brings us to a very simple, very unforgiving equation. Leftover food equals water degradation. See, because jellyfish actually ingest and are so easily harmed by suspended matter in the water, any uneaten food immediately worsens this whole particulate problem. It degrades the water quality exceptionally fast, which directly compromises the animal's health. It's wild. You have to feed them enough to thrive, but with such extreme precision that there is virtually zero waste left behind. Talk about walking a tightrope, right?
Honestly, it all boils down to this brilliant summary from our source material. Building a jellyfish aquarium is less about a single purchase and more about engineering the full environment. You aren't just rolling up to a pet store and buying a glass box. You are constructing a comprehensive, finely tuned ecosystem from scratch. From the precise physical curves of the acrylic to the microscopic biological filtration, down to the super strict husbandry routine, every single element has to be thoughtfully designed and flawlessly executed.
So, after exploring all of this, the immense dedication, the highly specialized circulation, and the absolute precision required to keep these mesmerizing creatures suspended safely in their own little customized universe, I've got to leave you with this question. Are you ready to become a biological engineer? It's a massive challenge for sure, but for those who actually master it, the reward is a living piece of kinetic art that's truly unlike anything else. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep exploring.